To an outsider, cancer is a tragic experience. Watching someone else's family go through it is hard, but being a part of that family is even harder. How does it feel to go through all the trauma of cancer? Families will either break or get stronger. Every situation has a different story, so buckle up. It gets rough. According to the American Cancer Society, cancer is the general name for a group of more than 100 diseases. Untreated cancers can cause serious illness and death. The body is made up of trillions of living cells. Normal body cells grow, divide, and die. After the person becomes an adult, most cells divide only to replace worn-out or dying cells to repair injuries. Cancer begins when the cells in a part of the body start growing out of control. Cancer cells can also grow into other tissues, which is something that normal cells cannot do. In most cases, the cancer cells form a tumor. Some cancers, like leukemia, rarely form tumors. Instead, these cancer cells involve the blood and blood-forming organs and circulate through other tissues where they grow. Tumors that aren't cancer are called benign. Benign tumors can cause problems. They can grow very large and press on healthy organs and tissues, but they cannot grow into other tissues. Because they can't invade, they also can't spread to other parts of the body. These tumors are almost never life-threatening. During the Renaissance, beginning in the 15th century, scientists developed greater understanding of the human body. Scientists like Galileo and Newton began to use the scientific method, which later was used to study disease. Autopsies in 1628 led to an understanding of the circulation of blood through the heart and body that had until then been a mystery. In 1761, Giovanni Morgagni of Padua was the first to do something which has become routine today. He did autopsies to relate the patient's illness to pathologic findings after death. This laid the foundation for scientific oncology, the study of cancer. The famous Scottish surgeon John Hunter suggested that some cancers might be cured by surgery and described how the surgeon might decide which cancers to operate on. If the tumor had not invaded nearby tissue and was movable, he said, there is no impropriety in removing it. Later on, the development of anesthesia allowed surgery to flourish in classic cancer operations. The 19th century saw the birth of scientific oncology with use of the modern microscope in studying diseased tissues. Rudolf Virchow, often called the founder of cellular pathology, provided the scientific basic for the modern pathologic study of cancer. The pathologist could tell the surgeon whether the operation had completely removed the cancer. Cancer is now handled in different ways, such as hormone therapy, radiation, chemotherapy, immunotherapy, and targeted therapy.
Julia started having recurring fevers with no other symptoms. The first time she had a fever, it ran out about 10 days, and finally at the end of that 10 days, they did a CBC and discovered that she had some levels in her blood work that were low. So we had to go back and repeat that blood work a couple of weeks later, but unfortunately then she had another fever, so she just kept having fevers on top of fevers and lowering blood counts that finally led us to a referral appointment to a hematologist, oncologist in Atlanta.
My first diagnosis was ALL, that's acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Not really, it pretty much stayed the same.
Right after diagnosis, I guess in a way I had already been researching leukemia and fearing that that's what she had, but still hearing those words that your child has leukemia, it just is very, very devastating, very frightening. At first, I think my husband and I both had to have on a game face. We had to be serious. We had to try to absorb and hear everything that the doctor was saying. But after all the record gathering and interview process, whenever that was a time that we just really kind of lost it. It was a heartbreak, it was a devastating hurt, it was anxiety, fear from areas of my heart I never knew were there. It was a very helpless feeling, wanting so bad to take her place. If I could only take her place, let me have it, not her. Don't do this to my child.
Yeah.
But it was very, very frightening. when we actually went to Atlanta, to Eggleston, we ended up going on an emergency basis, and we got there about 10 p.m. at night, and of course my parents were sitting by the phone all night, very concerned and very frightened. And we were finally hearing from the doctors somewhere around 3 a.m. that they thought she did have leukemia. And I think it must have been around 3:30 or 4, I don't remember, that I finally called my parents, and of course both of them answered the phone, and I told them. But I remember we had been given hope in the very beginning by our doctor that, the treatments for acute lymphoblastic leukemia were very successful. She should be fine. And so I remember having to pass that hope on to my parents. I thought I've got to be strong for them too. But I called them probably around 3:30 or 4, and then I called a co-worker friend of mine somewhere around 5 or 5:30 in the morning because I knew she was an early riser, to let her know. And that was really the only first 2 phone calls that I made. I'm sure, I know my husband made some as well, but then the phone calls really started coming into us. To me, I think she's still recovering. Her treatment lasted for 28 months. One of the biggest things that it affected her was she had a lot of neuropathy and had a lot of weakness in walking and running. While she was on treatment, walking became really a struggle. Walking distances became really difficult. Running became pretty much an impossibility. Her stamina was really weakened. And to me, she's just regaining that. She can now run. We work out exercising every week, and she's finally able to run for 5 minutes, run a mile, and every other week we're on the Central's bleachers, going up and down the bleachers, working real hard trying to regain that. So she still, to me, doesn't have the stamina that an 11-year-old should have, but she's regaining it. As far as her immune system, I think they ordinarily say about 6 months after her treatment ended for her immune system to kind of wake back up and kick back in.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the biggest thing was, having to learn to everything else that you had that was so important in your life, you sort of had to put that on the back burner. I mean, whether it was work responsibilities or whatever, that came second to her. So, of course, I only worked part-time, but suddenly I worked less than that. But the biggest thing, too, was we had to be well. My husband and I did not need to be sick. We could not be sick. And so hand sanitizer germs became, something that we were very aware of, and almost a phobia, to the point that, and I'm sure she'll agree with that, but I began thinking, every surface I touched, every surface she touched, don't rub your eyes, don't have your hands anywhere near your face, and, hand sanitizing constantly, because it was such a risk. With her immune system being so low, she didn't need to catch the flu. She didn't need to catch, any kind of virus or anything like that, because she didn't have anything to fight with. So we had to be well. We had to do everything we could to keep her away from somebody that wasn't well. Julia, do you want to tell a little bit about that?
You can.
Okay. Julia's treatment started in March of '09 and lasted until July 2011, so it was 28 months of chemotherapy. Her chemotherapy consisted of many, many, many treatments in her port. She had a port right here where she would receive her chemo and products, through her port. She had lots of blood transfusions, lots and lots of blood transfusions. She had to have many bone marrow aspirations where they took a sample out of her hip, out of her bone marrow to test that. She also had many treatments in her spine. She would be, sedated, and they would take spinal fluid out of her spine, and then they would also put chemo directly into her spine. She had a lot of injections, a lot of shots. Some of them we even had to do at home, which was very difficult. And of course, lots and lots of pills. She's a very good pill taker.
What were a few practical things that friends did for you that meant the most during your daughter's battle?
We had one friend that came up with, they called it a hat box, and it was this big box that they passed around to all the children kind of like in this community that have had cancer. And it had scarves and hats, and like they'd kind of, I guess you'd say, what would you say? They just were tons of them in the box. And after we were done with the box, we would put some in there and then give them to someone else. So.
And that was provided by, I know the little girl here that had leukemia 6 years prior to Julia. But also, of course, meals. You know, people were so good to provide meals for us. And that was such a relief to not have to worry about that when you got home. And then also we had, I know that after we spent the first week in the hospital and came home, I had an uncle that was mowing the grass the next day. You know, the next week a church friend came, mowed the grass, and that's something that, you know, you just don't need to worry about, yard work and that sort of thing. And grocery shopping, that was a big help.
What should someone keep in mind when trying to help a loved one through cancer?
I think for me, what I had to adjust and learn to, it was not to hover so much. You know, being a parent, you want to love and hug and try to take away any pain you can, and you have to learn to some degree to treat them normally. You know, life is continuing. They want to be treated as normally as possible, or that was in our case. You know, so many times I would go to touch her or hug her, and she's like, "Oh, Mama, don't touch me," because there were some chemos that she described it as her skin hurting, and it was like her body was bruised. So I had to learn to sort of back off and try to continue on and treat her like it was a normal day. And that was, I think, a big struggle for us.
What advice would you give to someone diagnosed with cancer?
I think, well, for one simple thing, the hair loss is not nearly as big of a deal as everybody says it is. Now, I'm saying that as a caregiver, as the mom. I didn't lose my hair, but, you know, everybody frets and is so upset about losing the hair, and I just think that's the least of your worries. Yeah. Of course, it's, you know, you need to educate yourself as much as you can about your disease so that you know the questions to ask. Always go prepared with a list of questions for your caregiver, for your medical team. But first and foremost, I think for me as Julia's mom, and I would think for any cancer patient, if you're diagnosed, to me it's be still and know that God is who He says He is, and that He is ultimately in control. And you have to learn to turn all your worries over to Him. Let Him carry you. Let Him lift you. And when you think you can't go anymore, you think you can't stand anymore, He's there and He will support you, give you the strength you need, and He'll use, you know, opportunities like that when you reach out to Him to make you stronger. And He's going to use any circumstance like that to bring glory to His name. And so I think just be still and draw close to God.
No matter where a type of cancer may spread, it's always named for the place where it started. For example, in my aunt's way of diagnosis, her disease started in her pancreas, so further on her diagnosis was pancreatic cancer. We learned that her cancer was also spread into the liver, and eventually shut down all her other organs. Different types of cancer can behave very differently. This is why people with cancer need treatment that is aimed at their kind of cancer. Today, millions of people are living with cancer or have had cancer. The risk of developing many types of cancer can be reduced by changes in a person's lifestyle. For example, by staying away from tobacco, limiting time in the sun, being physically active, and eating healthy. Something as small as tanning can be life-threatening, so think before you act. On a positive note, more people are surviving cancer, so more attention than ever is being focused on the quality of life and long-term outcomes of cancer survivors. Before, cancer was a word that people were afraid to speak in public, and people rarely admitted to being a survivor. Now, many celebrities and national leaders very openly discuss and share their cancer experiences. The idea that cancer cannot be cured and the fears that have historically been attached to the disease are slowly changing. My aunt was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, like I said before. She was already a huge role model in my life and was basically my grandma. We called her Tiggy. She quickly became my inspiration and daily motivation. She stayed positive throughout the whole time. We watched her go from completely normal, so it seemed, to yellow and non-speaking. She took her last breath with her husband, my mom, my aunt, and I in the hospital room. I've never seen anything like it in my life, and after being up there all day and all night with her, it didn't seem real. The diagnosis didn't seem real, much less her passing. It is not a thing you can change, but cancer is something you are challenged with. And like all of God's challenges, you can't do a thing about it, but grow stronger and seek His understanding and patience. because when these times come, all you want to do is give up. I challenge anyone who is currently going through this to not give up. Stay strong, because I assure you, the person you might be hurting for is hurting way more than you, so the least you can do is be supportive. I also want to challenge anyone who hasn't experienced it to be grateful. It isn't something to be boastful about, obviously, but it also isn't something to be shameful about. Speak out, lend a hand, do something, because like my Tiggy, we never know when we will watch someone leave our sight.
I don't understand your ways, oh, but I will give you my song, give you all of my praise.